Okay, so last lecture I talked about some objections to utilitarianism and how I think the utilitarian might answer them, right? Again, none of these things that we're going to be reading besides Plato are set up as Socratic dialogues, but I do think this is a good practice, to picture yourself as somebody asking the utilitarian or Kantian or virtue theorist or any of the moral theories we've talked about, asking them questions, presenting them cases, seeing how they would respond. And I do think the utilitarian has some pretty decent responses. Now, in this lecture, I want to get into some slightly more complicated stuff, and I actually think that there are more interesting and troubling objections here for the utilitarian, but they're a little harder. They take a little bit more to set up. So, let's do that. And the first objection here is that what happens is not the only important thing. How you are involved matters too. All the utilitarian cares about are the consequences, but this objection says most of us would care how we are involved in what happens and not just the results. Now you can already see this with the sort of biological chemical weapons or oil company case. Doesn't just matter, the profits or whatever. It matters that it's me making chemical and biological weapons or whoever are working for this company. But I think you can think of other cases where this is really important. I gave you the ventilator case when we started. I said, well, imagine that this person, you have to choose. You have two sick people. One is older. Most of us would choose the younger person. Well, but think of a similar case. Imagine that it's not that you have to choose who to hook up. Imagine that the older person is already on a ventilator, but you run out of ventilators. Do you take him off, even though doing that will kill him, to hook up the younger person or not? Most of us would say, not everybody, but most people I've asked would say, no, you shouldn't do that. But notice the consequences. The thing the utilitarian cares about are exactly the same. The older person dies in either case. For a utilitarian, these cases are exactly the same. If you think they're not, then you have to think something besides consequences matter. To put a bit more detail on this, one of the ways that how we're involved matters is that most of us think there is a big difference between doing and letting happen. Doing something bad to another person versus letting a bad thing happen. And this works out in a lot of ways. We'll talk about it a bit more when we get to Kant on lying and some other stuff. But, one big way that it works out is killing versus letting die. If you think there's a difference between the two ventilator cases, well, what is it? Well, in one case, the older person, you're not doing anything to him, you're just letting him die because you don't help him. Well, in the other, you are doing something to him. You are taking him off of this ventilator. You are doing something that results in him dying. In one case, you are letting him die. In the other, you are killing him. And most of us think, and a lot of our ordinary moral judgments depend on this, that there is a difference between doing and letting happen, killing and letting die. Think about rescue cases, right? I think a lot of the Singer article, Singer just kind of assumes that there isn't a difference, right? And utilitarians, effective altruist types assume this too, but there is. Legally and morally, there is. If I let someone drown that I could have saved, I have done a bad thing, right? You are going to judge me. You're going to think that I'm a worse person than you would have before if I tell you that, right? I mean, I haven't, so don't worry. But look, if I kill someone, that is actually much, much worse legally and morally. We blame somebody more for killing someone, and we think it's harder to justify killing someone than we do letting someone die. It is a far different thing, despite what effective altruist types might claim, if we push somebody into the water than if we just don't save them. Both are bad, but most of us think that one is far worse than the other. And think about it this way, right? If I come across a child drowning in shallow water and don't save him, he's not any worse off because I was there, right? If I hadn't been there, he would have still died. If I push someone in the water, I have made their situation much worse. I am responsible for it in a way that I'm not, or so most of us think, than I am in a case where he just happens to be drowning and I don't help. Utilitarians deny this. If you think that there really is a difference between doing versus letting happen, well, you're not a utilitarian. But this is a pretty important distinction, right? I mean, more fanciful cases, if you have an organ and you're having to choose between someone who is healthy, has good habits, say it's a liver, versus someone who's a drug addict, well, you would give it to the person who's healthy, not the drug addict who might overdose. Why? Better consequences. So far, so utilitarian, right? None of us would think, though, that you could murder the drug addict to take his liver to give it to a healthy person. It is okay to let him die because you need the liver to save someone whose prognosis is better. It is not okay to kill him to save that person, even though the consequences in both cases are the same. He ends up dead. Same with the ventilator. Utilitarians just don't care about this. They don't see that there's a real difference between doing versus letting happen. They might bite the bullet on this. I think for most of us, this should be something we worry about because we do think this distinction is important. So I'll go on and wrap this lecture up here. I know I spent a bit of time on this point, but it's a subtle one, but it's a very important one. That for a utilitarian, how you were involved doesn't matter, and that also means that doing is the same as letting happen. For them, all that matters are the results, not how you're involved. For a utilitarian, not giving the person a ventilator because they're old and their prognosis isn't as good and they won't live as long even if they live is exactly the same as taking them off. For most of it, it's not, because we would think one is a doing, one is a letting happen. And one is a killing, one is a letting die. Most of us do think that it is harder to justify a killing than a letting die. It is harder to justify doing something bad to someone than letting something bad happen to them. Utilitarians don't think any of that, and it's just part of their theory, right? If all that matters are the consequences, numbers are the same. Doesn't matter how you get them, right? Just want to make that very clear because it's a slightly subtle point, but it's very important.